Good evening, everyone. My name is Pelham. I'm the president of the Montclair branch of the NAACP. And along with other community partners, this forum is extremely important to this branch. And Mr. Scott, who is my housing chair and also the commissioner of the housing committee, co-chair of the housing committee, along with Deirdre, Malloy. So they'll be addressing you. But I just want to welcome everybody. There's a tremendous amount of data that's going to be thrown out at you guys today. I encourage people to listen, hear what you need to hear, ask as many questions as you want. The process is going to be our great moderator, 4th Ward Councilwoman, Dr. Baskerville. We'll introduce everybody and we'll give all the panelists 5 minutes or so to kind of say what they need to say, but the bulk of the evening needs to be questions from the audience. And whatever comes in your mind, you need to say it so we can move forward on this. Right, so it's a very important topic, and as the president of the branch, we're very pleased to put on this forum. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, sir. Good evening, everyone. I'm really excited to be here. I'm grateful that you all are here, and we're just going to get things underway. Let's see, how did we get here? Because as most of you know, we've been looking at rent control at other points in time in the history of Montclair. And so what has precipitated us to revisit this at this time is an increasing outcry from residents of various neighborhoods that feel as though mainly two driving factors are causing rents to increase much faster than their paychecks are going up. And one of them is the fact that many of them believe that as new landlords purchase buildings, they come in and automatically increase the rents and don't show much regard for the fact that some of them have been in the same apartment for years at a certain rent, and now all of a sudden their rents are going up at what they consider unconscionable amounts. That's the number one reason that I've heard. And the second one is that many people feel that as development is happening in neighborhoods that historically have had primarily rent-controlled or affordable units or workforce housing, and developers are coming in with very high-end, very expensive rental units. They believe that that is causing their landlords to try to increase their rents, to creep up on the rents or to go up drastically and use the fact that, well, across the street, you know, they're getting X amount of rent, and so now I'm going to increase the rent on this side too. So a lot of people have been hit by that. People are feeling as though they're being forced to leave our wonderful township before they're ready. People feel as though there's negative gentrification happening. And many people feel as though it's falling on deaf ears and people don't care. And so we're here tonight, I'm here tonight because certainly I do care, it's very important. We know that this has to be a collaborative effort, whatever we do, to involve everybody, involve all of you and all of us working together to see what we can do. As you know, our township has done an outstanding job with affordable units for many decades. We've done such a great job in that area that we're in a position now to opt out of COA and to create a situation where we can provide our Montclair residents, our municipal employees first options with affordable housing. So we're good for that, but we really need to take a look and find out, is rent control something that is good for Montclair? And if it is, you know, how are we going to make that happen? As many of you may know, the state does not have rent control. That's each municipality takes care of what their rent stabilization is going to look like. And right now, about 100 of the cities across the state have opted in to have some type of rent stabilization. And so we're here to look at that. Right now, the language that the state uses to try to decide if somebody is going up too much on your rent is unconscionable. And of course, that's very vague, and you have to go through a legal process to try to figure out what is unconscionable. And my thought is that it would be much easier if we can come up with something more uniform where each individual doesn't have to then go through the process to determine unconscionable or not. And so that's what we're going to look at today. We have an esteemed panel of individuals from diverse backgrounds who have taken time out of their evening to come and to share information as well as answer questions. And hopefully we'll be able to do that, and everybody will get some information, and we'll leave here fired up and ready to take some type of actions. As the Temptations have said, and many of you may not be old enough to know them, but tonight we're here to talk about people moving out, people moving in, rents on the rise while the paychecks stay very thin. And that's what we're going to do here tonight. So I'd like to begin by introducing, well, I'm going to have each panel member introduce themselves. And so why don't we start right here with Kathy Curry, and she's going to introduce herself, and we'll go down. Can everybody hear us in the room? All right, we're good to go. And there are cards that are going to be passed out, so if you have questions and you want to write them down, it's fine. If you want to later take the mic, that's fine too. So let's go. And thanks again for being here.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you for coming. My name is Kathryn Allen Curry, and I am the broker-owner of St. Allen Realty here in Montclair. It's a family-owned business, and we've been here on Bloomfield Avenue for over 60 years. And I've been around. I started in the business once my father passed in 1974. And in 1979, that's when the township demolished some of the buildings over on the north side of Bloomfield Avenue. You can hear? And people were displaced. And then in 1982, the landlords got together and the tenants got together because they wanted to talk about rent control. And the landlords did hire a firm to come in and talk to them to talk about why rent control would not be good for Montclair. They did have a referendum, and it was voted down. Now we're in the same place, and people are being, as Councilwoman Baskerville said, being displaced. The rents are high, and we have people that are on Section 8, and they cannot stay in Montclair. And if you look at the rents that are in the surrounding towns, such as Bloomfield, West Orange, East Orange, they almost can't go there either. So it is a problem, and it's something that we really need to address.
Hi, everybody. My name is Peter Harrison, and I'm coming to you in sort of two capacities. The first is as a longtime tenant advocate and organizer in New York City. I've been through now, this is our third fight up in the state legislature to extend the rent control laws that are affecting in New York City. And my second capacity is as the senior housing advisor for Data for Progress, which is a progressive think tank. So I get a chance to kind of think about these issues at a national level because it is a national crisis. Half of all renters in America are rent burdened. Displacement, gentrification, homelessness are rising across the country. So I think it's important, even though fundamentally housing is tackled at a local, even building by building level, that there really is a national crisis here. And finally, there is some movement about these kinds of issues, rent control specifically, at the national level. So I'm certainly happy to talk a little bit about that. And I'll just sort of close by saying New York City is well known for being a sort of a rent-controlled town, yet it's only about half of the rental units are actually under rent control or rent stabilization. So that has a lot of issues sort of inherent with that. One of them is that tenants aren't actually organized that well because they're half of the tenants that don't have any protections. So what's unique about this particular time in New York, which is certainly impacting even in Montclair, is the fact that we're sort of on offense for the first time renewing the laws. There's a program, a series of 9 bills being fought over in Albany right now called Universal Rent Control that is closing up a crazy amount of the problems with existing rent control laws in the city, but also expanding them across the state of New York and expanding them to previously market rate tenants. That's something that's sort of similar with sort of a good cause that's sort of vaguely familiar with what's going on in New Jersey. So I'm happy to talk both as a tenant organizer, it's done this building by building for 10 years, and also from the national landscape, because it is important for us to think about this as a national crisis, that what's happening in Montclair is happening across the country, in towns, and what happens in Manhattan impacts what happens out here. So we're all sort of in this together.
Thank you. I'm Peg Seip, and I'm an urban planner. I've worked in building, preserving, and protecting affordable housing resources since the 80s when I started off in the South Bronx. I'm also a Montclair resident. I've been here since 1996. I've worked with the Housing Commission over the years, and I'm grateful to Mr. Smith, Mr. Scott, and Ms. Malloy for organizing this event, as well as the NAACP. And I'm a member, I've served on the Housing Commission, the Planning Board. I'm a member of the Unitarian Universalist Congregation. And I've raised my twins through the schools here, from the community pre-K to Montclair High, where they graduated in 2017. I'm especially grateful to Dr. Baskerville for the strength and integrity that she brings to these issues. And we just couldn't be doing any of this without you. A good urban planner listens to people and recognizes that the folks going through the situation are the real experts. And what we do is bring some data and information. I can be happy to talk about that a little bit later, and to amplify what you're going to hear more from Ms. Allen Curry, Mr. Harrison, and my co-panelists about both the situation that we're facing and the things that we can do about it. But when I was in planning school, one of my teachers used to say, so what and why? And so we'll get you the information, that's the so what part. But the why, I think, is as important as anything else. And all I can say is that when my husband and I were trying to figure out where we were going to live, we picked Montclair because of its diversity and because of its values. And if we don't do something to preserve that, we're going to lose what we have. We're going to lose what makes this town valuable. So.
Hi, my name is Mitch Kahn, and I wear a lot of hats, but I'll just give you a few. I'm one of the founders of New Jersey Citizen Action. I'm still on the board. We founded that organization in 1981. We are the largest citizens' rights and citizens' advocacy group in the state right now. But more important for purposes of the discussion tonight, I've been the Vice President and Director of Organizing for the New Jersey Tenants organization since 1974. I started with NJTO in 1971. I was a tenant. I was living in an apartment that had problems. I saw that there was this brand new organization called the New Jersey Tenants Organization. I went to them. They gave me some advice. I was a community organizer by background, so they just wrote me right in, and they just never let me go. But since that time, since 1971, at a time when there was no rent control in any communities in the state of New Jersey, between 1971 and the early 1980s, we won rent control in 120 municipalities in the state of New Jersey. There are still over 100. We lost them in some places. And we even lost a couple of battles in Montclair when we try to get, when the tenants here try to get rent control. So I'm here tonight to answer any questions that you might have of what goes into a rent control ordinance, what you have to do to make sure that it's legal and it meets the test of legality and the constitutional legality around rent control, and what you have to do to win rent control, because that's really the most important thing. You could walk out of this room knowing everything in the world about rent control. It's not going to do you any good whatsoever unless you do something about winning rent control in this community. So hopefully I'll be a resource for you this evening.
Thank you. My name is Baye Adofo-Wilson. I am an urban planner and lawyer by training. I've been in Montclair since 2001. I'm originally from Patterson. I guess I too wear a couple of hats. My previous job, I was the deputy mayor and director of economic and housing development for the city of Newark under Baraka's first term. And currently, I am a developer where I am working on mixed income housing, arts and cultural projects, and historic projects, primarily in African American communities in New Jersey. And one of the things that I feel is also important about sort of these conversations around gentrification is really the displacement of Black and brown people in these communities. And a lot of these communities are historic. They are places where, near public transportation, near major commercial corridors, and for decades, scores of years, they have just sort of been deteriorating. And so what you see in a lot of these places, when you don't have the rent control mechanisms, when you don't have the rent stabilization mechanisms, or sort of set aside affordable housing, you also see that over time, the communities become less and less diverse, at least in terms of, less and less Black and brown people. And that's, I initially moved to Montclair primarily because it was sort of, my mother was still in Patterson at the time, and I was working in Newell, and it was a close place to be. And it was a close place it was just close. It was a close place for our family. I grew to appreciate it and love it because of my children and so the experiences that they were having here. My youngest child is at the high school. She's a junior. My daughter at Howard. But what I think is part of this conversation, essential, and that we can't dance around, is the sort of racial impact of gentrification and what that's going to mean to a town like Montclair that has such a rich African American history and culture.
Okay, thank you very much.
Testing.
Okay, thank you. So as you can hear, we have an outstanding panel, and they are ready to address some of the questions. Before we get into that, I'd just like to take a moment and acknowledge all the people that are participating and who have worked very hard to make this happen, and our event sponsors. Event sponsors include our Montclair Township Housing Commission under the leadership of our co-chairs, Mr. William Scott and Ms. Deirdre Malloy. Certainly, Mr. William Scott has led this entire fight. He continues to do that and stand up for us and stand in the gap for us on housing matters in the township of Montclair. And without Mr. Scott, none of this would happen. So I'd just like to pause and let's acknowledge him for all of the tireless work that even in planning this event, that we started it out as a collaborative, but we're all very clear about how we ended up. And I'd like to thank you, Mr. Scott, and Ms. Deirdre Malloy, who is also working tirelessly in the area of housing. We have the Montclair Civil Rights Commission, who is a supporter, Montclair Fourth Ward Collaborative, Montclair Interfaith Clergy Association, African American Clergy Association, the Senior Citizens Advisory Committee, Montclair High School Center for Social Justice. Where are our Center for Social Justice students? I see one. Is there anyone else here? Montclair High School student? Okay, we'd like to acknowledge you. The Montclair United Way of Northern New Jersey and the Montclair Salvation Army, Montclair Neighborhood Development Center under the leadership of Mr. Albert Pelham and a collaborative of people, and certainly I'd like to acknowledge Mr. Albert Pelham and the entire NAACP for working to make this event happen and tirelessly addressing the many needs of people who are often overlooked in the township. So Mr. Albert Pelham and the rest of the executive board and members of NAACP, thank you so much for what you do at all times. Mr. Pelham, where are you? Anyway, Mr. Pelham. And the Homes of Montclair Ecumenical Corporation, Home Corps, they have been providing affordable housing, beautiful affordable housing in Montclair for a long time. So those are our event supporters. And before we go on to questions, Mr. Scott, did you wish to say anything before we go on? Yes. Mr. Scott.
Good evening, everyone. I really want to say thank you for everyone that's coming out to participate in this forum. Obviously, I really appreciate the panelists to take their time coming from New York and throughout the state of New Jersey to really help support this affair. It's critical that we carry this conversation forward. What we're going to also do at the end of the forum as we wrap up, we're going to find out from a residents' standpoint, the tenants, we're going to absolutely call upon you to get involved, to make the next step, to make sure we move this conversation forward. Because this is something that's critical. We know there's something going on behind the scenes within the township. A lot of development is taking place. Prices are going up very high. Even the and I never really wanted to say Section 8 rental properties, but you can't even get rental property at a modest rent price, and that's really a problem. So if you're not able to get anything to come into our township, we're having a difficult time keeping people in our township. This is critical. I've been told on a couple occasions it's taken too long to really move this initiative forward. Well, it's been 30 plus years since we've had this conversation, so I think we did step the conversation up a little bit there. But I also want to bring my co-chair, Deirdre Malloy, up to say a few words. We've been bringing on, and I wear two hats. I'm also, as Councilwoman Baskerville mentioned earlier, I'm the co-chair of the Montclair Housing Commission, but I've been the chair of the NAACP Housing Committee. I've lost track of how many years, but I haven't lost track of what needs to be done. So I'll turn the mic over to Deirdre.
Thank you. I, too, would just like to thank everyone for coming out, and our panelists, thank you for being here. We really appreciate you taking the time to discuss this important matter. Just a couple of points. William Scott mentioned that we will be asking tenants to move forward to push this issue because it affects you, it affects other residents in the township. But I handed out cards to everyone, and this is for you to ask the questions that you want to ask. You can do it anonymously through the card, and when you're done, you can just raise your hand. I'll come get the card and give it to our moderator, Councilwoman Baskerville. Or if you'd like to speak, you can do so by coming up to the mic over here. Thank you so much for being here. And one last thing is when you leave, please share this information with others. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And so the reason that it's really important to identify who the township supporters are is because if you can imagine, if this long list of supporters, if they all got 10, 15 people to come together and to take affirmative actions to help us move towards some type of rent stabilization in here, then we're no longer, standing alone. We're no longer a room full of 5 or 10 people, but we are an expansive group. And so that's one of the reasons why it's extremely important for people just to know that there's a long list of supporters here, and that's encouraging. So let's begin with the first question, and we're just going to start with some basic things that I don't want to assume that anybody knows or doesn't know, so bear with us. And the first question is, what is rent control? Does anybody want to discuss that a little bit and maybe talk about the difference? Is there a difference between rent control and rent stabilization? Is it just a changing of the names? Does anybody want to take that? Okay.
Okay, we got it over here. Okay. Is this on? Does everybody hear me? Okay. In New York City, there's something called rent control and rent stabilization. They're two different things. It depends on when the year the building was built. Buildings before a certain time period fall under rent control, which was a stricter form of rent stabilization, and then there's a rent stabilization law, which has a slightly different set of guidelines. In New Jersey, the term rent control, rent stabilization, and rent leveling are used interchangeably. And what that means is that under those towns that have rent control, landlords are entitled to raise the rent once every 12 months, a specific percentage. That percentage could be a fixed amount, 1%, 2%, 3%, 4%, or it could be a formula, the rise in the consumer price index. So if the inflation rate is 3% or 2%, which is what it's averaged over the last 12 or 15 years, that rent increase would be 2%. Some towns have it as half of the consumer price index. So if the consumer price index goes up 2%, landlords could raise the rent 1%. So rent control is exactly what it sounds like. It is a legal mechanism to control the escalation of rents, and it prevents landlords from just getting what they want. So some people said, well, without rent control, landlords are going to try to get as much as they can. And some of those rent increases might be unconscionable. So I have no doubt that probably people in Montclair are getting rent increases 5%, 7%, 10%. And we might consider those unconscionable or unreasonable. And somebody raised the issue, what is unconscionable? Well, in New Jersey, unconscionability is defined as, hold on to your seats, folks, that which will shock the conscience of a reasonable person. Well, what does that mean? What shocks the conscience of Barack Obama, would that be the same thing that shocks the conscience of Donald Trump? They both would say they're reasonable persons, okay, but they're not. So it's a very, very vague definition, and it's up to the judge. So some judges might be pro-tenant, some judges might be pro-justice, some judges might be pro-landlord, some judges may play golf with landlords, some judges may even be landlords. So what shocks the conscience of one judge may not shock the conscience of another judge. And so one judge might say 5% is unconscionable, another one might say 10%. Based on my experience in New Jersey, generally the unconscionability threshold in the New Jersey courts has been somewhere around 10%. That doesn't mean that if you get a 10% rent increase, some judge might not uphold it. That's why there is a need for some form of rent control or rent stabilization in order to at least stop the rapid escalation of rents. Somebody else might want to. Yeah, I'll just add.
Okay.
Is this on? No. Sorry. Thank you. I guess as the resident New Yorker, I feel like I should jump in. And everything Mitch said was absolutely accurate. I guess the one thing I just want to add to it is the basic history of it, because rent control was a federal national policy during World War II for price controls. The war industry pushed a lot of workers into some of the major cities. There was a huge production crunch on housing, so FDR put this in basically across the nation. After World War II, that sort of switched over to states, and a number of states that really were not experiencing housing crises as urbanization really kicked in, didn't continue the program, but in New York City it sort of did. And then it started getting decontrolled over time, and then the Vietnam War started another big inflation crunch, and that's kind of where the rent stabilization came in. So it's rare in New York to see rent control. It's less than 1% of the rental units. So rent stabilization is primarily the bulk of it, and that's about 47% of the units. And it's been, it's a state program that runs it, but it's effectively just in the 5 boroughs of New York City, and also in Westchester and Rockland County. And just the sort of metrics of it, there's a rent guideline board that every year comes together and has, some would say, kind of a problematic determination of what the cost of the price index for a landlord. It's energy costs, it's maintenance costs, it's whatever these sorts of things are. And that gets put together by a board of folks that are landlords, that are tenants, that the mayor appoints every year, and that's kind of where the percentage is added. It's all but 1 year of the rent guideline board, an increase has been enacted. 2017 was the 1 year it was a rent freeze. So at least there's a predictability there for rent-controlled tenants and rent-stabilized tenants, but it's still a fight every year with those groups to come in and sort of push back on some of the rent increases.
Do you want to give a rejoinder to what he just said? Yeah, I know, but this mic, I think, is louder, isn't it? Sounds louder. Anyway, in New York, there's a law. That is the state legislature. State government controls rent control. Municipalities have to follow the dictates of the state legislature. In New Jersey, rent control is a local matter. There's a combination of state Supreme Court decisions, and I won't get into all the legality of them, which gave municipalities the right to pass rent control to protect the welfare of tenants that live in that municipality. We can talk about all the kinds of pros and cons, whether local rent control is better than a state rent control ordinance, but for all intents and matters, in New Jersey, it's going to be the municipal government that governs rent control. The landlords would like nothing better than to abolish local rent control and move it to the state legislature. It would be much easier for them to fight it.
And so, is everyone here familiar with what rent destabilization and rent deregulation upon vacancy means, or should we ask our panelists to discuss that? Because I know we're getting a lot of great questions up here. I don't want to ask questions if everyone is familiar with the terminology, but if not, I think we should discuss those. What do you think? Okay, so let's see if one of our panelists will answer for us rent destabilization and rent deregulation upon vacancy. And the other thing that I just wanted to say before we go to that, somebody mentioned HUD housing before. So all of those types of housing, the HUD housing and the senior housing and the Section 8 and all of that, they are a separate item to be discussed, because that's the federal law will determine how much they can go up there. So 42% roughly of our Montclair residents are renters, and then so you would exclude the people that are in those types of housings, and then we'd be addressing the rest of those. So people just need to understand that they're not included when we're talking about if we're deciding to do a municipal rent stabilization of some sort, because the federal law will determine how much they can raise the rents. Okay, who wants to do the destabilization and rent deregulation?
Okay, rent destabilization and regulation is when a unit becomes vacant and you can increase the rent at one time. It becomes, you can increase it for that one time to make it not affordable, but market rent. A lot of times landlords' rents are not market rent. A lot of landlords I know for a long time would not increase their rents. And sometimes it's good to increase the rent so that your value doesn't go down. However, when you increase your rent, you get one chance to do that, and after that, you can increase your rent, the normal increase, whether it be 1%, 2%, or 3%, but you get one chance to do that.
Is that when if there is rent control, or just under what circumstances is the rent?
That's when it's under rent control.
But what about if it's not under rent control? can increase it.
Well, if it's not under rent control, you can increase it anytime you want, yes. And there's some towns that have rent control, but the rent control is only on units 4 families and up. The 1 to 3 families are not under rent control.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for answering that question. Is everybody clear on that? Any questions? Question here.
One of the people renting downstairs, they were paying on time. They were paying on time, and their rent was $14.75. It went to $3,300 or $3,600 in for their next lease, and this is a little scary. I have been in, when I used to pay $1,050 when I moved in. I'm 64 years old. Now it's $1,596, so it's like a 52% increase in 6 years. I'm just wondering, you know, because I'm trying to understand the language of ability for landlords to up their rents, and I know they have responsibilities for the, you know, paying the taxes and all of that, but they have not done anything in my building, actually in my apartment for the last 6 years. I'm the one maintaining it, hiring people to do the proper work in there. It's crazy. And yet, you know, I know that it's going to go another $150 probably by June for me. So that's kicking me out, basically. Where am I going to go? You know? So I wanted to know what's the difference between 2 family, 3 family, you said. I'd just like to have more understanding on this, please. Thank you.
Does anybody on the panel want to answer that question for the gentleman, please?
Yeah, I don't want to get into a long song and dance about unconscionability, but that the people that face those kind of rent increases, there is a legal defense. So I'd be glad to tell you afterwards, but the long and short of it is if someone gets a rent increase like that, they should write a letter to their landlord. I've received your request for a rent increase of, it sounds like it's almost 200%. That is an unconscionable rent increase, and I refuse to pay it. However, I would be willing to negotiate a reasonable rent increase with you. Period. Sincerely. Send it certified mail and regular mail and wait for the landlord's response. If the landlord doesn't negotiate a reasonable rent with the tenant should refuse to pay the rent increase. Let the landlord take the tenant to court and try to argue that a 200% rent increase is conscionable. I think even the worst of judges will find that to be unconscionable. Okay, when they start getting lower and lower, like if it's a 10 or 15% rent increase, then it's going to be a borderline situation legally. But there is a legal remedy to that. No, you don't have to pay for a lawyer. You can represent yourself. One of the things that I'm going to emphasize here, and I know there's some lawyers in the audience here, is that oftentimes you can do as good a job for yourself. Okay, and in the long run, you know, it's more important that you learn your rights and you learn how to use the law than just run to a lawyer. I mean, if you want, you can get a lawyer. Okay, I'm not saying don't, but something that's kind of simple. I'm going to pass this over to a lawyer.
Before you answer that question, I'm sorry. There is information on the table, tenant rights in the state of New Jersey. It's a handbook that tells you exactly how to go about it. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm not going to advocate that you don't get a lawyer or that you do get a lawyer. But what I do think is important is also the number of units you have in your building, and that maybe one of the things that can happen, at least on a legislative level, is how do you bring that number down in Montclair? Is there a way to sort of use to bring it down from 30 to 20 units? Because what ends up happening in all these smaller cities, you don't really have a lot of large apartment buildings. And so there's a lot of people who are excluded from rent control because they just are not living in rent control units, they're not living in rent control apartments. but there's also just not a lot of large apartment buildings. So maybe an analysis should be about what should be sort of the threshold number in Montclair, and is 30 the right number? Is it 20? Is it 15? Is it 10? But I think that should be put before the legislative body.
I'm, as a planner, I'm focused a little bit more on the other side of things. Very supportive of the case-by-case, apartment-by-apartment, tenant-by-tenant fight. But I also do a lot of thinking about what we need to do proactively to change the circumstances in town. So if you remember what the federal standard for what is considered affordable, and that doesn't mean the definition under which you get certain kind of subsidies. It just means this is what the federal government, what the standard for affordability is. It's probably, it's what my mom and dad told me when I was starting to look for an apartment, which was you start to figure out how much you should pay for housing costs by looking at 30% of your income, okay? So when you pay more than 30% of your income for housing costs, I know everybody's kind of like, how do we do that right now? The definition of that condition, when we're paying above 30%, we're paying 40%, 50%, sometimes even more, is that you're described as being housing cost burdened, and some people describe it as shelter poverty. And in Montclair, looking at it as a planner, the numbers are kind of interesting. So if you figure we've got about 39,000 people in town, friendly numbers, let's make it 40,000, that's about 3,000 more than we had in 2010. That's a 4% increase. So it's a good place to live, right? People are coming here. That makes about 14,000 households with a little bit more than 2.5 people per household. I know, planners, what are we thinking about a half person? 25% of the people who are living in town are under 18, so we have a lot of kids. However, it should be noted that the greatest number of children live in single-family housing, not in apartments. You're going to hear a lot of arguments sometimes, a lot of ignorance sometimes, about why you don't want affordable housing because they're children. It's not true. The other part is that we've got about 12% are 65 and over. That's seniors, you could say. That's about 5,000 seniors. And then we have another 8% of the poverty level, 8%, about 3,000 people who are living below poverty level. So just a really quick, how do we figure out how much affordable housing do we need, how much rent control, how much new development, how much preservation? Without even thinking too hard, you got about 8,000 people in town who are at great risk, grave risk of displacement and shelter poverty. So what happens when people are housing cost burden? What does that actually feel like? What does it look like? You all can tell me, we'll hear your stories, but one of the things that I do in town is I serve dinner every Wednesday night at the Unitarian Congregation Mesh Dinner. In the last 3 years, the number of people we serve every Wednesday night has clicked up. We're now serving, as of this last year, 80 people every week. That's a lot of folks to cook dinner for. And who are those people? Well, you'll hear some people say, oh, well, they're coming in from East Orange. For one, that's a terrible, terrible thing to think, and an even worse thing to say. But who those people are, I know Dr. Baskerville is there, but if there are any elected officials who have not yet served at a Mesh dinner, I invite you. There are 12 houses of worship serving dinners throughout our town, and you should be there and you should be sitting down and talking with the guests, because you will discover that those people are seniors who are cutting back on their food in order to live in their house. They're cutting back on their medications. Partners for Health, the United Way, Alice, can tell you what happens when people can't afford to keep their housing. and they stretch out their medication and they don't go for health care. So you end up with a really, really desperate, unhealthy group of people who need more care to begin with. We're also seeing families whose children are coming to our dinner because the families know they're not going to be able to get another meal until they're at school for lunch the next day. And we do everything we can to send people home with food. The other people we're seeing are students in school and recent graduates who are trying to manage their debt and their housing costs. And there are more and more and more people. And I think that that is the actual face of housing poverty.
Thank you very much. Before we go on, I'd just like to pause and acknowledge our Mayor, Robert Jackson, who took time out of his evening and adjusted things so that he can be here. He's been doing an incredible job in the township of Montclair. He's the only individual that's ever been elected for more than one term and continues to do things. And I call him the numbers man because he does wonderful things in that area, but he also does great things in the area of housing. He listened to us. We've had community meetings ongoing. This is not the first one, and he heard us saying, you know, it's an awful thing that we have to be a part of an area, catchment, where our residents may never get included in the affordable housing, and Mayor Jackson took the lead on that. And because of Mayor Jackson listening to people and understanding what we need today, we now have, as I mentioned, we're no longer in the COA, the group of the Coalition on Affordable Housing, and we have the opportunity to give first priority to our Montclair residents and municipal residents. So I thank you, Mayor Jackson, and I'd like you to celebrate Mayor Jackson. Okay, so let's start with the questions from the audience, because there are many, and I think these will really start to address some of the things that maybe more than one of you has. The first question says, how can we get the support for township residents and potential residents? We continue to see accommodation for developers, but not for citizens, especially those on fixed incomes. Does anybody have any thoughts on that?
I think there's at least in terms of what type of accommodations that can be sort of done for residents, I just really believe that there should be a larger percentage of affordable housing in the requirements for the projects. I think that that's one way of increasing the number of affordable housing units. I also, one of the things that just, and I'm sort of still stuck on what Peg was saying in terms of the numbers of the people who are coming, and I was thinking about, you know, just trying to figure out if there's ways to provide more senior housing in town, if there's a way to sort of approach it, at least demographically, because it is really sad for folks who have lived here so many years who end up getting priced out because their incomes become fixed and then they can't afford to stay in the town any longer. And you know, folks have been here their whole lives, 30, 40, 50 years. So maybe figuring out ways, if there's opportunities, to create more senior citizen housing so that the residents have an opportunity to sort of continue to age in town and still keep all the amenities. I also, one of the other things that struck me that she said was about how many of the children live in single family households. You know, so the notion that most of them live in apartment buildings is just not true, because they live in mostly single family households. So the notion that there could be other ways to increase the number of affordable housing units, mixed income projects that target multiple demographics, that allow for more residents to benefit from it, as opposed to the developers, and then holding the developers accountable. I know that in my previous job, the developers were always asking for everything, right? They were always asking for, when I was deputy mayor director, they always wanted 100% of everything, and if you gave them less than 100% of everything, they felt like you cheated them. And that just was the dynamics of the conversation. And so you have to push back on them. Because what ends up happening is that it changes the quality of the town, it changes the township if you don't sort of take a stand and say, oh, this is important for us, you know, and are creative in terms of coming up with solutions that benefit the entire town as opposed to just them. And I think that it's challenging because oftentimes the developers are very powerful, they come with a lot of resources, and they have a lot of friends. And those friends impact how legislators or even the staff think about it. But you have to sort of approach it in a way that's more aggressive.
Specific to Baye's recommendations, we have two initiatives in town that we can make them better. They're a good start. We have an accessory dwelling ordinance that can be modified in order to enable people to adapt their homes that they live in to provide rental income so that they can stay in place and they can be affordable. And we do have that ordinance. It needs to be fixed a little bit to be a little bit more applicable. The other thing that we have is called inclusionary zoning. It requires that when someone builds more than 6 units of housing, 6 apartments, they are required to create 20% of their units as affordable housing. That has been on the books for a long time. When I served on the planning board, I have scorched eyebrows, I think, from the amount of lawyers and developers who came in and just blasted us against that affordable or the inclusionary zoning. They would cry about, oh, we can't even do 10%. And the developers who I know who are skilled and capable affordable housing developers in this housing market, they say you can do 25% and still make money. So it might be worth, and the Fair Share Housing Center also advocates for 25% of new development being affordable. So it's something that we can look at. If a developer says they can't or they won't do 25%, there are possibilities of having discussions about other kinds of things that could be done. But we don't need to start the discussion at 10%, which is often what has happened.
Can I ask a question? How many units, affordable units, have been developed under that?
Oh, it's the one piece William Scott probably knows. Okay. Thank you.
Okay. I believe over the last 10 years, we had been getting the 10% allocation for affordable housing. There's probably, and I really want to make sure I'm clear on this, Home Corps has been managing 500 or 600 affordable housing units in the township of Montclair for the last, how many years, Mr. Kent? 65 units. But you work towards getting that 500, 600 number. Exactly. But as far as the bigger numbers, when you're looking at the bigger developments, you know, when you look at the bigger developments, we had not been getting the 20%. As an example, the Montclair Residence, which is a unit that was built about 10 years ago, it was about 163 units. We only got 10% affordable units in that development. The Sienna is another example. When that was built a number of years, that was a 100-unit type development. We only got 10% in that particular development. And then we've had a lot of infill developments, which are the smaller ones, but what we've always tried to do is go after the significant numbers, okay? If we're only going to get 2 or 3 units, that really didn't make a difference in the equation. So being on the Housing Commission for 10 years, and I would always question the negotiating skills that were being presented to the developers and why we weren't getting those 20% going backwards. Well, we can't discuss that. We can't change what happened in the past. But what we've been able to do moving forward, and as Councilwoman Baskerville mentioned, with the leadership of the council, and I will absolutely say some prodding from the Housing Commission, we have finally gotten to the point that all development, whether it's private development, areas of redevelopment, or rehabilitation, will always include 20% affordable housing set aside. So as an example, when you look at the If we move forward with the Lackawanna Plaza project, there's going to be 150 some odd units in that development. We're going to have 30 affordable units in there, okay? When you look at a couple more developments that have taken place, you know, it has always been interesting. We've bounced back and forth a little bit there, but we know we have it set in place now moving forward. We have the 20% for the town residents and people that are within the township that will qualify for affordable housing. So, you know, we're working hard to make sure that we stay on track with that 20%. As you can see, there's a lot of development on the table within the township. But I just go back to the point where the affordable housing, we'll never build enough affordable housing in the township of Montclair to solve that piece of the equation. You need both sides of the equation. You not only need the 20% set aside for affordable housing, but we have to have some type of regulation to slow the increase from a market rate standpoint for the units that are coming on market. And a lot of the new developments, these prices are astronomical. And Montclair is an absolutely great place to buy property. I mean, there's units that are being turned over because they're older apartment buildings, and as a lot of the audience know, those buildings are being turned over, and those units are being pushed to the 15, 20% area. So we have got some major problems.
Let me just
Deirdre, Ms.
let
Malloy.
me offer you one piece of
I'm sorry,
information.
Ms. Malloy is acknowledged. Ms. Malloy? You need a mic? Okay, her concern is the accessory dwelling units, and so the way the language of our ordinance for accessory dwelling units is written at this time, it precludes an exchange of financial resources. It's more for a family member or if a person, an elderly person, needs some type of support in the home. But at this point in time, and that's why I believe you heard that, you know, we need to continue to massage that and to try to expand upon what is presently in place for our accessory dwelling units. I'm very proud to say that just a week or two ago, we did, the planning board unanimously did approve a granny flat is what they call it, or ADU for a Montclair resident. And so it is working for some people. Who's a senior in our community and well celebrated. She came and she wished to remain in her home, and she's going to live in her 2-car garage. She's going to have a kitchen there, a bathroom there, and a living area, and her family is going to move into the main house. And so right now our ADUs don't allow for exchange, so that if somebody wanted to just rent out that unit to somebody, that is not part of the current ordinance, but we do have more work to do. The other thing that I wanted to say, just in answer to you know, the township resident support, I don't think that everybody realizes how huge it is, because even as Mr. Scott is discussing, you know, percentages, 20%. So if before we had nothing in place from the township to make sure that that 20%, whatever it is, if it's 20 units, if it's more, whatever that percent is being considered first for our Montclair residents, it really wasn't helping us to the degree. So when the question was asked, you know, what are we doing? I think that that shows, you know, a lot of concern for our Montclair residents, the fact that we're now going to prioritize for the Montclair residents. Before, 20% might have been 20% of everybody, and nobody from Montclair get in. And so we are doing that. The other thing that we're talking about in the Housing Commission is possibly doing some pilots in areas to change the zoning, so that where there might be a larger Victorian home, and I'm just saying Victorian because that's what I think of when I say large. I don't really know that much about that. They would know more. But a larger home, considering doing some things that would provide housing for perhaps developmentally disabled community, or people that are seniors that wish to remain in town but no longer wish to stay in their home, and just open up, you know, a whole new arena. So we're looking at things. Yes, it takes time, but I think we're moving in a good direction for those types of things, and that I think we've demonstrated that, you know, we are interested. I believe also that it would be very helpful to have some type of controls in place regarding how much an individual landlord can raise the rents. We've been successful in doing it on an individual basis, and again, under the leadership of our mayor, he's come in and stood in the gap for individuals that have had their rent increasing as much as 30%, talking about unconscionable. And so thus far, we've been doing it and successfully on an individual basis, but we're here tonight so that we can continue to move along those lines and see if we need to do more. In order to determine those things, we would have to find out how many residents will be displaced if we don't do any type of rent stabilization, and we'd have to answer, more questions. And so this is part of the process. But I feel confident that we are moving in the right direction. Here's a, Oh, you'd like to answer the same question again, or, okay. Yes. And I'm going to try to limit how many people answer the question, because the wonderful thing is we've got a whole stack of questions here. And so after you, Baye, address that, I'm going to move on with some of the questions, because I know some people might have come out here just specifically to have, their question answered. So I want to do the best job that I can to get your individual questions answered.
Just really quickly, you had mentioned something about pilots, and I think that is a way to sort of incentivize the market. As Mitch was saying, a lot of new construction, so they're exempt from a lot of rent control and stabilization after 1989. But the real issue is for any pilot that you provide, you can then tie affordable housing into those, either for new construction or for substantially rehabs. And so you can put that number in there. It can be 10%, 20%. But if someone wants a pilot, if they want a tax abatement for their property, then they are required to do it. It's a contract. And that number you have flexibility on because it's an agreement. It doesn't necessarily have to be just sort of the legislative number, and it can be whatever sort of, you can do it one-on-one if you want to, or you can have a policy based on the number and size. But that allows you to get a little bit further into the market. I also do think, too, that the Montclair should probably think about a lower number in terms of what triggers rent control. I'm not sure if you can even do that now, but if you can, a lower number. But that's it.
Good. Thank you so very much. Yeah, you can.
We have a question here that says, what are the affordable options? How long are the wait? Some say it's at least 2 years. This person's family is not on the Section 8, and their rent is $14.50, and they are struggling to balance. This person's children are in elementary school, and they really want to stay long-term. There are several affordable housing options that fall under, or I should say in the category of affordable rent. We have in the audience Megan York, who is from Community Grants Planning and Housing. She is a planner by trade, but that organization based out of Cranberry, New Jersey, is the affordable housing administrator for the township of Montclair and many other municipalities. Through their website and or the township's website, you can go in and put yourself on the wait list. However, as it was mentioned, and I'm sorry for digressing a little bit, Montclair has changed their ordinance so that residents who live here who wish to stay have the opportunity to apply, somewhat like a first preference. However, you still have to go through the screening process. If you want additional information, you can put your name on the clipboard back there, and we'll be happy to help you. Another resource in the building is U.S. Department of HUD. Ms. Velez is in the back. She deals with equal opportunity, Section 8, and things of that nature, and could answer questions relating to this. That's as much as I can say at the moment. One second. Thank you.
Megan, did you want to add anything to it, or you're fine? Okay, we're going to move forward. Some of the questions here are broad-based, and so I'm going to try to pull out the ones that are more geared towards rent control, which is the main thrust for tonight, but I'm going to try to get to the others if we have time. So here's a question that says, how do we get rent control on the ballot? Question mark, can it be done for the next election? And when? Anybody know the exact dates for the cutoff? And if we have to get a petition signed, I just don't know the date. Do you want to answer that? Anybody know the exact date? How far before then? Mr. Scott?
I don't know of an exact date, but I know of an exact date for the election that's going to be coming up. So what you want to do is organize. We've got 12 months to put together a tenant organization, a coalition throughout the township of Montclair. And if you can bring to the attention of the current administration or the administration or the individuals that might be running in the next election, I think that they will pay attention if we raise this as a #1 issue in the township of Montclair. Now, we've got some issues from, obviously, from affordable housing, but we've addressed that. The 20% is in place. That's a conversation that we're going to move on past at this point in time. But the fact that the town is very prosperous, there's a lot of development, there's a lot of investment in this town, but the residents have invested a lot of time from a renting standpoint. They absolutely should have a voice in what their future is in this township. So your task is going to be to organize. The time frame is before you pull the lever on the next election. That's what you really need to understand. So I'm going to continue to refer back to our little pad over on the table. We want to take down as many tenants that feel they want to be involved in organizing and moving the questions forward, putting petitions together to present to the current administration or future administration.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
And then I just want to quickly add, and I didn't answer the question, how many affordable units are going to be available? Oh, okay, excuse me. There was a question posed to me in the past, and I didn't answer it directly. Just keep in mind, from Bloomfield Avenue in Orangeville, where you have the Valley Bloom development, all the way down to Maple Avenue, where you're having a couple of developments put in place. You're going to be looking at the Seymour Street development is underway. That's 200 units. As I mentioned, the Lackawanna Plaza is going to take place at some point in time. That's another 150 units. There's a few developments on Glenridge Avenue that are going to be taking place. You're going to be looking at several hundreds of new units being built in the township of Montclair. Another thing, people need to be prepared if they qualify for those units from an affordable standpoint. But we still want to make sure that, I mentioned earlier, we want to have both sides of the equation addressed. We won't have enough affordable housing ever built, but we want to make sure that we can slow the process down on the increases on rent over the next whatever amount of years if we can put some type of regulation in place. Okay?
I was just wondering, I know I'm asking a question from the panel. I was wondering if we could know a little bit about whether there are rent control ordinances in neighboring towns. Does anyone know about that and could speak about that? Yeah? Okay, do you want to take the mic over there? Does it work? It doesn't work? I'll take this one.
Yes, there are rent controls in other towns. Bloomfield has rent control, East Orange, West Orange, Newark, they all have rent control. In Orange, Caldwell, Verona. The East Orange, I know their rent control is only on 4 families and up. And for 4 families and up, you can go up 4% a year, 4 to 5% a year. It's 6%? Oh, 6 families and up. I know that West Orange has it, but I just want to say that if you want rent control, it's up to the tenants to force it. The landlords are not. So the tenants have to form an organization and get that going.
And Councilwoman, can I just add a quick second to that?
But I just wanted to go back to the other question when somebody said, how do we get this on the ballot? You really need to contact, I guess, the county. And I was trying to figure out the latest date. If there was some activity that wanted to go on the process, then there would have to be a referendum. How you know, when would be the latest time? So I don't have all the exact dates, but somebody at the county could tell you the process if there's no one here tonight that could help you with that. Because if that's something that people are considering or they want to do it, there is a process and it needs to be started, I would guess, sooner rather than later. Mayor Jackson, do you know, or anybody? No. So I'm sorry, I just don't have the knowledge on the dates on that, but you do need to get started on that sooner than later. Yes, sir.
I think, how many people here want a rent control ordinance in Montclair? Okay, I think you have to think about organizing. There's a number of different strategies that you could employ. One is, first and foremost, no matter what you do, you've got to form an organization, a townwide tenants organization, or a townwide committee in support of a rent control ordinance. You can go 2 routes. One, you can go the referendum route, which I don't necessarily recommend, but we could talk about why. Or you can go the mayor and council route. And if you want to go that route, what you want to do is to get one sympathetic council member to introduce a rent control ordinance. And you begin to organize around that ordinance. How many people are on the council? 7?
Yes.
So you need 4 votes. You need 4 votes. You need 4 votes. And you work to get 4 people on that council to vote yes on that ordinance. That means showing up at every council meeting with 50 or 100 people, and every time there's the public session is open, you get up there and talk about the need for rent control. You yell, you scream if you have to, but you show that council that you're not going to go away. As Mr. Scott said, there's elections coming up. Whatever rent control committee or tenants organization you have should screen the candidates that are running and support those candidates that support that ordinance and oppose those candidates that don't. In terms of what kind of ordinance you come up with, we could give you a dozen great rent control ordinances that exist in other towns that you can tweak and craft specifically for Montclair. In terms of the number of units that are covered, some ordinances cover every rental unit with the exception of owner-occupied 2-unit buildings. If they're not owner-occupied, everything is covered. If someone wants to rent their house, they can put it on the market, they can rent their house for $5,000 or $6,000 a month, but once they do that, that's under rent control. So if they're entitled to a 3% rent increase, do the math. That's what they're entitled in terms of a rent increase every year. They'll be entitled to a $180 rent increase, but they're under rent control. The main thing is you got to organize. That's the only way, and you got to organize successfully. We could help you with that. I'd be glad to be a resource person, but you have to have a committee group that are willing to do that.
Thank you. What I would like to say is that we want to maintain order and decorum, right? And although sometimes you have to shout and argue and things of that nature, this is an opportunity for first knowledge and information. This forum is specifically to give you information and facts. And this is why we have experts on the panel that understand this process in detail and we have a broad array of other experts who can bring additional information to the subject matter. But what I will recommend is that if in fact you plan on organizing, do it in a respectful and tactful manner, because that's the only way you're going to, one, be heard, right? If you go in like gangbusters, and I'm not trying to tell anybody how to behave, because you can certainly behave any way you wish, but I need you to understand that if you want to be heard, you should probably do it with decency and order, have yourself thoroughly informed, and then understand specifically what it is you're asking for. And as you just heard, there are different options of the ordinance. I happen to be very knowledgeable about it. However, this is why we have this gentleman here, and we have Mr. Baye, correct? Baye, pardon me, forgive me, here, as well as the other panelists to answer the questions. So this is a fact-gathering moment, I would recommend, and the request that I and the Housing Commission and the NAACP and certainly the moderator have is just, ask the questions and then gather the ideas. There's a clipboard, and then we can talk about next steps after that. But I'm personally and professionally requesting that we maintain order. Thank you.
Okay, and so moving right along, I'm going to ask a question to Mr. Khan, because you mentioned that we can get the ordinance going, and then some communities have all of the rentals included in that, and I just want to find out if it is a fact that in New Jersey we still exempt new developments from rent control ordinances for 30 years, or are they no longer doing that, and you can just put your new developments into the rent control ordinances as well? Mm-hmm.
New construction is exempt.
Correct, that's what I thought. I was asking that because during my time of trying to address this, but if you wanted to talk about that, because I think as we have these discussions, it's important that we really stay focused on what we're talking about and what that would look like in Montclair. And so if people are saying, oh, this is great, we have Lackawanna, we have the one up by the Wellmont, we have various buildings coming, and now if we can get them all rent control, I want people to understand that to the best of my knowledge, and I'm not the expert here, these are the experts, but to the best of my knowledge, from what I can read, it appears as though the new development is exempt from, if we passed a rent control ordinance for roughly 30 years. Does anybody want to, Mr. Baye?
Yeah, one of the things you can do, though, is if they get a 30-year pilot, the building could be affordable or have affordable units for those 30 years, and at the end of those 30 years, then it would go into rent control. So you can sort of structure the pilot to do sort of the same thing, and sort of have the same sort of requirements and even reporting requirements if that's what you're interested in doing. And then at the end of the pilot, then it would be eligible or required to go into rent control.
Okay, and I think, again, that's very important for everybody to understand, because since we've already committed to, 20% affordable units on our development moving forward of certain number of units, so we've already got that in place. And so, again, if we're going to have a dialogue, I just want people to really understand what that might look like. Also, when you're talking about comparing ordinances in other municipalities, while there are similarities, you have to look at, are we doing apples to apples or apples to oranges? It might, look a little different. So I'm saying these things because I really, and I've already said, just so everybody is clear, that I do believe that we should be moving towards some type of standardized rent controls. But with that said, I'm not somebody that just wants to go out and start making decisions and not being thoughtful and not understanding what we're going to do. Because if we give thought to what we're going to do and what that's going to look like, and we have more information when we finally sit down to try to draft things, the likelihood of those things being successful for longevity or in perpetuity are far greater. We have, yes. Mm-hmm.
I just want to add one point to this, and I will caveat this by saying this might not be the case in New Jersey, but in New York City we have the same issue. So the rent stabilization laws only apply to buildings built before 1974, 6 or more units. So it doesn't apply to any new construction either. The workaround for that that's being fought right now is, and it has different names in different states, but effectively it's called good cause eviction. And what this basically says is this is, as opposed to a formalized structure of rent control, this allows a couple of things for any tenant depending on how you define it. But it's a right to a lease renewal that you are guaranteed, whether you live in a building with 2 units, 20 units built yet last year or 30 years ago, you are guaranteed a right to renew your lease. And second, you are guaranteed at a reasonable increase. And that can be, again, depending on the state, depending on the ordinance of whatever percentage. The advantage of that, of course, is it does get around, a lot of states have these sort of restrictions on whenever the rent laws were put into place or whatever the local ordinances are. A lot of states actually have a blanket ban on these types of things that block cities and towns from doing this stuff. So that might be the case in New Jersey where 100% get rent control on the books, and it takes a lot of organizing. But the workaround for particularly this law in New Jersey is good cause eviction. It gets you the same type of protections under a different regime. But the number one point is that it gives you the opportunity as an individual tenant like you, sir, to push back, have a legal standing, have a right to get in front of a housing judge or whatever judge without legal representation to say, no, I have a right to this renewal, I have a right to a reasonable increase. And that gives you a lot more power in a market rate building to have tenant organization around that.
Another thing I wanted to mention was, is this working? Yeah. Was in the spirit of thoughtfulness and process, a very easy next step and a very useful one would be a simple administrative procedure at the town level. Every year, landlords register their apartments, their buildings, and so they put in a form. Hopefully they're doing it online in Montclair, and it says how many apartments they have and what kind of apartments, X number of 3-bedroom, X number of 2 bedrooms, etc. What would be extremely useful to this cause, as well as any other thing that we're going to do relating to preserving the diversity, economic diversity in particular, as well as other kinds of diversity in our town, would be to, when the landlords are putting in that registration, to have them note what the rent levels are. It's, as my kids say, it's a little bit of a no-brainer. It's a form that's going in already. If it's online, it's just one more piece of information. We pay for staff to go through information. Megan is giving me a hard eye right now because this is kind of probably something that would come to your desk, I would imagine. But if we do that, if we start to ask landlords to register their rent levels, we're going to know exactly how much rents are going up, and it will be useful information for everybody. So I would ask the council and the town to consider doing that right away. And then the other thing, thank you, is, Mr. Harrison, is to, even though the focus for this evening is rent control, to look at it in the broader spectrum of tenant protections. So anything that can be done to stop evictions. I would say they're the most destabilizing thing that can happen to a person in a family, I think. And as well as other ideas that people may have and be able to talk about.
Are there people out there that would like to raise their hand and be recognized and ask a question, or should I just go with the cards here? Okay, in the front. You have a mic for? Mm-hmm.
I hope I don't take up too much time.
No, we're going to help you to not take up. No, we want to hear your question, but I've already seen a couple of hands in the back as well. So, yes, we want to hear from you.
Okay, thank you. First of all, I just want to say that I'm for solving the problem. I'm a resident of Montclair for over 30 years. The good doctor and my child used to play together when they were little. And one of the reasons why I came to Montclair was for the educational system for the children. And part of that education was the diversity of the town. The thing that I really feel very strongly about, and I know that you all have this vested interest in rent control, but Montclair is really known as an innovative environment, not a one-size-fits-all environment. And I would like the panel, and I'd like the audience, to think about how this could be done to solve Montclair's problem. And I don't personally believe that a one-size-fits-all is the answer. I personally believe that the first thing to do is to identify where the problems are, who has the problems, how much of a problem there is, and then address that. I also think from the other side, I'm not a politician, but it just seems to me that there's a very big degree of difficulty here in accomplishing the objective unless we see everybody's point of view. I know that people are coming here because they want their rent to be stabilized, and I get it, but you have to see everybody's point of view if you want to get over. And it seems to me that the large new buildings, you pretty much have your solution. The people, the older, the smaller buildings, I happen to own some rental properties. They're 2- and 3-family houses. This would be, a big burden on people with smaller buildings. That's why places like Bloomfield and other communities have made it their business to make it 5 or 4 or 3 apartment buildings to be exempt. But what does that leave? It leaves the older multifamily buildings. And a lot of the people who need housing here are already in smaller buildings. So I'm proposing that instead of taxing, which it is in effect a tax, instead of taxing the landlords, either some or many, why not have a broad-based approach where every home is taxed. Every building has a portion of their income or a portion of their taxes that goes to people in need. And those people in need, again, if one size fits all, it won't help. It creates a bad situation. It creates a lack of incentive for landlords to fix up their buildings over long periods of time, which is really one of the reasons for the demise of rent control over a long period of time.
Thank you so very much. And so he's saying that not one size fits all, and that we're a little bit more thoughtful about how we approach this and consider everybody's opinion. I saw in the back, and then I saw over here. I'm
One
sorry,
moment.
you saw somebody else? Oh, your hand is up too, okay. Bouchette, welcome.
Yes, hi. So my question is, who is responsible? That's a main question. Who is responsible for the rent control? Can anybody tell me that?
We have no rent control in the municipality of
I know who's
Montclair.
responsible to mandate it, to let we have one.
And so as you heard here, that can either be done through an ordinance by the town council or a referendum on a ballot. Those are the two most popular ways that I'm familiar with.
What's stopping the town council from doing it? What's stopping the town council from doing it?
Well, quite frankly, and somebody else asked, what's the position of each member on Montclair Township Council, on rent control and some other things? I can't answer that question. So at this point in time, I can say that as far as I know, all ears are open and people are, exploring things and listening. I don't think anybody has just said, I don't want to hear from the residents. And so here's what happened thus far.
The residents think that
I'm sorry?
the residents think that the council don't care about what happens.
Okay.
They're just interested in their money.
Okay. And so it's unfortunate that I believe some people do believe that as we participate in different forums and try to come out and lend our time and our service and our ear, and as I mentioned, in alignment with what he's saying here, that maybe one size doesn't fit all, I've also said that in this past year, there have been some situations that could have been devastating for renters. And because the mayor and other members of the council have stepped in to those situations, to this day, some people are able to remain and afford their residence. And so while we're looking at whether we want to do a uniform across the board type of ordinance, or if we want to continue and do it in some other way, we're not sleeping and doing nothing. We are addressing the issues. I don't know if any people are here tonight that were in some of those devastating situations that want to address the fact that because of intervention from our mayor and some council members that some situations changed. So it's not that we're sitting doing nothing. I understand the urgency, and I can understand why people that are in certain situations feel that way.
No, my rent, as you know, was raised $500. Trust and believe, the panel is saying to take it to court, the landlords are going to win. And all that's going to happen is you're going to get kicked out. Listen to what I'm telling you. I had to move. The tenant on the second floor just had to move. You're going to get kicked out. Because you don't have the time to go down to court and fight and battle with all these little developers and all this kind of BS. You're going to lose. So you might as well think about a backup plan. You're going to lose. Second, what's my name? But let me just say, thank you, Renee, because you're the only councilwoman we've seen, according to him, at least 3 my kid. I have a third ward council guy, I don't see him until it's voting time. Yes. That week, third ward, then you see Spiller.
And so let me just interrupt and let you know that while I'm physically here, each council member has been assigned to a different area of expertise and interest. But I'd like to say also, and I appreciate you for recognizing my interest, but I'd like to say without a doubt that the Economic Development Committee members who are presently taking a look at some things that we can do and if it would be in our benefit, and that includes your 3rd Ward Council member Spiller and our 2nd Ward Council member Robin Schlager, that all 3 of us are equally interested in trying to make sure that we can maintain the diversity of this township by providing various forms of housing. The 2nd Ward Councilwoman Robin Schlager was extremely helpful with the Talbot Village that just went up in the 2nd Ward, the first affordable unit there. And so I don't want, just because you don't see everybody at every meeting, I don't want anybody to walk away and think that it's a Lone Ranger. I don't feel that way. I feel like I have some supports. Whether there's 4 votes right now to do an ordinance on rent control tonight, I don't know, but I do believe that we're actively working on it. I saw a hand over here. There was a hand.
The person here has a
yes,
question. Again, I just want to stress that while it is true, many tenants are losing in court, this is the beginning of education and empowerment.
I'm coming up here because, can you hear this? I'm coming up here so you can all see me very clearly. At the beginning, they said some of us would come up, so you don't have to turn around to see me. My name's Ahava Felicidad. It's been 36 years since my late mother was a founder of Home Corps. Okay, so I'm standing up here on behalf of her and all the residents who she and the Home Corps founders fought for, and it wasn't just thoughtfulness, because the thoughtfulness is not going to keep those of us who need to stay in town here. I've had to consider moving to another township. I'm a business owner. I lost a home behind a rent increase. Home meaning my apartment home. And I was born and raised here. 36 years. So, in order to keep this short and sweet, I'm volunteering. And I'm not going to volunteer by myself. I'm expecting a minimum 3 people to stand with me as co-chairs, and we're going to referendum. I don't need 4 votes or 3 votes from a council, or to put the responsibility on someone who's a homeowner who's not even a renter. So if you're a homeowner, you're not saying anything. And for the thank you. And for the issue with the housing and this overall, if you're an owner, of course you don't want. But we're surrounded by towns with rent control. And I should not be, and no family should be. I am your diversity. You are the diversity. You're the diversity. You're the diversity. You are the diversity. That belongs in this town. So if I have to be here to speak for everybody else that couldn't be here, we're going to go out and we're going to get them.
Okay,
and we're going to do a referendum.
Thank you very much.
Where are my 3?
Okay, Abraham.
Thank you. Thank you. I'll be very brief. What I want to say to Shay is you can win in court, but rule number 1, you must have your rent money no matter what. They put it into escrow. Number 2, winning in court doesn't always mean that you get your way, because what the landlords do, they fabricate things. They out-lawyer you. For an example, I have called the Montclair police 41 times because of my landlord her harassing us through coming by all hours of the night, doing work. You went through this fumes the other night, Pluche. We went through it last week. The problem I'm finding is, although I'll say 90% of the police officers that came were pretty pleasant, but the other 10 to 15 seem to be complicit with the landlord. The only way the landlord can get you out is by building a case. She can say that, in my case, she said I physically hit her. Thank God I always walk around with the on camera. The judge in Montclair threw that out. She tried to claim that she wanted to move from the Upper East Side in New York to move to an apartment in Montclair. My lawyer had me to go get the deed to find out what happened. She sold 3% to her boyfriend. The judge sent it to the civil division. The civil division is able to vet through a lot of processes that the landlord-tenant court can't. Mind you, 13 times I went to court, 8 times I was by myself. I was successful. Finally, we decided to move out because it becomes so stressful. We didn't want to move. We never had a problem paying out $2,000 rent. We're a $90,000 household. We can't receive help from anywhere. I worked with Miss Barbara from home court. Our name was on the list, but nothing ever came out of that. I'm just hoping that, I want to thank you guys for putting this together, but I feel as though that there's people like me who play by the rules. I'm not complaining about the rent going up. I just want to get what I pay for. I'm not receiving any help. I do have a lawyer, but it's expensive. And at the end of the day, there's not too much that can be done unless you go to civil court and sue. That's another process. So, okay, all right, so thank you. Anyway, I just want somebody to try to help me.
Another one of the questions that came up on the card is regarding the tenants organization. As far as I know, usually that begins with tenants. And so I think it would be a great idea to get a very strong tenants organization together under someone's leadership and encourage others to come out and take action. And I think that that would be a very good step. We have about 15 minutes left, and so you're at the mic, so I'm going to allow you your question, and then I'm going to allow the panel, after they've heard, you know, the passions, the anger, the concerns, the questions, some things, just to close out with some information. Yes, ma'am.
Okay, thank you. Can everyone hear me? Okay, great. My name is Reverend Safia Oni Brown. I've been in town for almost 40 years. We love it here. It's a great community. So I really think that is the first aspect that I really want to bring back into the whole aspect of rent control. The first being the positives for both landlords and tenants. I come from 3 generations of people who owned buildings and multifamily dwellings. One of the things that my grandmother used to do, yes, this was a long time ago, but when she found that she had renters in her buildings that really took care of the location, made it feel like home for them as well as for others, she would assure that their rent stayed at a reasonable rate, and they would stay there long term and take care of the environment like it was theirs. So it can work for both landlords as well as renters. Also, I've worked with NJTO in the past, New Jersey Tenants Organization. They are amazing. They helped us with some major issues in town, especially issues with developers building and not building quality locations, mold issues. A lot of these buildings, including the Sienna, has a lot of mold issues. I've talked to a lot of people who are older as well as younger, especially seniors, who complain about the mold and just really health conditions that they have because of the shoddy workmanship. So yes, this is about rent control, but if we don't get with Matt, Khan and Shapiro, Mr. and Mrs. Shapiro, I don't know if they're both still there, and organize and mobilize so that we can have an organization. Together we can do it. That's what Montclair is about. So let's get together and make it happen, because we will get results and be able to maintain the amazing diversity and quality of the town that we live in. So thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, panelists, do you want to give some closing thoughts? And then I'm going to have Mr. Scott and Ms. Malloy close out. And if President Pelham is here and he wishes to say anything else, we'll start with you.
Okay, I will be quick. I am just thankful for being here, and it's been great to hear the stories and comments. I think that it was very informative. One of the things I find really sort of sad and it's actually kind of tragic about gentrification is that, a lot of the people here are here because they love this community. The township, they enjoy it. They have built this community up over generations and over time. And it's really sad when gentrification happens that the folks who sort of built the community then can't even stay. And so I think it's important to really sort of think about the timing of when you really move forward with the idea of rent control, because it's not going to be, today's the cheapest it's going to be. Today's the least expensive it's going to be. It's going to be more expensive tomorrow, more expensive the day after that, more expensive the day after that. So the least expensive day you're going to have is today. And so the sort of window of opportunity, the timing of when you're going to sort of go about it, that time is now, or it's just going to get to a point where you can't. The town is really blossoming. There's a lot of, we talked about a lot of the different developments, obviously the commercial stuff, and as I have a child in the hospital, and I think she's having a great time. It's been really helpful for her at the hospital, at the high school. But I think that thinking about the timing and coming up with a solution about this, and the great thing about elections is that they do sort of they sort of crystallize in terms of timing what's important and what's not important.
Well, I'm not going to try. I'm going to try not to be redundant. A lot of things have been kicked around here tonight. There's an affordability problem, an affordability crisis in Montclair. There's a number of solutions. One that have been things that have been touched on: inclusionary zoning, inclusionary housing. That is, if somebody's going to build housing, a certain percentage should be affordable. That's one piece. Rent control is another piece. Rent control is not going to solve the affordability crisis in Montclair. What it will do is protect those tenants who already are in town. Because if you don't have rent control, some of those tenants, some of the tenants in town here are going to be on that list waiting for the affordable housing to be developed because they're not going to be able to afford their apartments. Rent control will slow down the rapid escalation of rents in Montclair. That in itself is a reason to support it. For those people who are living in their apartments and they can't afford those apartments now, the enactment of rent control is not going to make that apartment more affordable. But if, like this gentleman just said, he can afford his apartment, he has no problem paying his rent, it's going to protect him, because rather than getting like a 10% rent increase or a 15% rent increase where he's got to go down to court and fight it, he may only be getting like a 2 or 3% rent increase. So think about it. And again, the key is organizing, because unless you organize, it's not going to happen.
Okay, just to be additive here then, I grew up in New Jersey, I went to college in New Jersey. When I moved away, I thought it would be wild horses that brought me back to New Jersey. And when we came back, we chose Montclair. And the reason was because Montclair had always been a beacon of progressive capability and intelligence and good values. I'm not talking about housing values, I'm talking about people values. And that's where I wanted to raise my family, because I wanted them to grow up with that. So if we are on the verge of losing that and becoming a town of millionaires, I am grateful to the folks who have come out tonight, who have stepped forward and said, we will organize. Please let us know what help you need. Come to the Housing Commission, come to your faith communities. I think the Interfaith Community and Clergy Coalition is starting to look at this issue. If we can get, Mitch Kahn says you need 50 people at meetings. If 6 churches and 5 synagogues and a couple of temples are all working and mosques are all working on getting people out, we'll have more than 50 people at meetings. So let us know how the Housing Commission can support you, and thank you.
Just want to say thank you so much for inviting me, and I loved hearing more about Montclair. I'm an activist, so I'm going to focus on that. Number one, you can fight back. Every single person in this room can fight back. That means, first of all, knowing your rights. Second of all, expressing your rights. Third of all, it means knocking on doors. Know your neighbors, know the people in your building, know the people around the corner, and organize. You can fight back. Second thing is, know who your enemies are. It's not property owners and small landlords. Maybe some of them are, but more often than not, they're your neighbors, they're the parents of your kids in school. They could be on your side, they just don't know they're allies yet. There's going to be a lot of money spent from developers that want to gentrify this town. They're the enemies. They're going to go out trying to knock on doors of property owners, small landlords, and say rent control is scary, rent control is going to hurt your property values. That's a bunch of bullshit. Your allies are people in this town that care about this home just as much as you do. So find them, tell them why it matters to you, and fight back together. Politicians, at the end of the day, listen. Everyone that came, I mean, there's 80 people here, whatever it is, like the mayor's here, the council people are here. They listen. They can be moved. No one's as blind to what a developer wants. They want what you want. They want you to fight for your home. So get out there and fight together.
I just want to thank everyone for coming out. And there's a lot of information here. I want to thank Mr. Scott, the mayor, Councilman Baskerville, and all of the people that helped put this together for you. It's for you, for your information. And as I say, if you want something done, you have to make them do it. So you have to have your voices heard. Go to the council meetings, go to the other meetings, go to the housing meetings, get together, get an organization together. You have to get together. The squeaking wheel gets the grease. And you know what that means. You gotta keep at it, you gotta be persistent. But you have to organize and you say, why isn't the council doing? Let them know what you want them to do. Okay?
Thank you. I'm just going to briefly respond to something that was said, and I don't always do that as a moderator, but I'm going to take that liberty tonight. Ahava, I love you. I had a wonderful and loving relationship with your mom till the time she died, but I do find it to be very young when somebody stands up here and says, if you're not a renter, then of course you want the rents to go up. And I would really like for everybody to understand why that's so wrong, because the history in here in Montclair, even how this meeting got started and whatever, Mr. Scott, he's a homeowner today. Many people that are active and in the community every day and fighting, perhaps stronger than other people that may not be able to do those things, that just happen today to be a homeowner by the grace of God. That doesn't mean you should dismiss them and that they don't care and that they're not as passionate and that they're not going to continue to be more active than many of you are to fight for you. So don't close doors. Let's open doors for everybody that wants to join the same fight that many of us are here for, and let's welcome them. Just to, nail that home so that nobody leaves here thinking that there's any substance in that statement. That's just like if you don't have cancer, you can't be passionate or understand and try to help to find answers for cancer. So let's lose that thought and let's continue to work together and embrace everybody that says, I'm here for you. I'm going to come to whatever meetings, I'm going to host the meetings, I'm going to lead the charge, I'm going to go back to council, and I'm going to do so-and-so. And let's don't dismiss anybody that is here and shares our similar values and our desires. And that's all I wanted to say. And then I'm going to let Mr. Scott and Ms. Malloy close out. But thank you guys. I've received what was said. I took notes, and even on some of the cards that I wasn't able to respond to, I did hear you. And yes, I am going to continue to fight with you and for you. I've been a renter in Montclair probably for more years than my friend Ahava's been alive. And by the grace of God, just a very few years ago, I was able to come into home ownership, and I'm grateful for it. And I want to make sure that as many people as possible, that wish to stay here, that we do all that we can. And I believe that I'm a strong part of the history as well as my sister Ahava. So thank you, guys.
Again, I'd like to thank everyone who came out. I think this was very informative. Would you agree? Great. Of next steps. We have many people who have signed up to take those next steps. I want to make one housekeeping update about the Housing Commission. It's the fourth Wednesday of every month at 7 p.m. at 205 Claremont Avenue in the council chambers. And then one thing I'm going to say, we do have someone in the audience who purchased a home that was affordable. However, the taxes went up, and he has a tenant where he wanted to keep the rent low. The home is on Washington Street. And because his taxes have gone up so much, his home is no longer affordable. And so he's struggling with how much he's going to need to increase the rent, which is going to impact the tenant. It's a not good situation, but I want us to, those of us who can provide some support and information, to be able to do that after this event is over. Now I want to bring up my co-chair.
Thanks. Let me just jump in here really quickly. I'd like to acknowledge Councilman Russo has joined us here. I don't know, he just wants to wave at you. Again, Mayor Jackson, did you wish to say anything, sir? Okay, and so Mr. Scott, thank you so much for making this all possible, and we'll let him close out. Thank you, guys.
And I just want, can we have a round of applause for the panel, please? Thank you.
Well, first of all, just from a housekeeping standpoint, our sign-in sheets have, for some reason, we do. Rita, we have them. Okay, whew, okay, great, okay. We didn't want to have to sign in again, but thank God that that's not going to be the case. I'm just really, I am just thrilled that we had the turnout today. This conversation hadn't taken place for almost 30 years. It's a step in the absolute right direction. We're going to have some more meetings. I'm not going to disappear. I'm going to put my name on that list and work with the tenants that want to move forward. I just don't say no to anything. So I just want to let people know that this is extremely important. I've been fortunate and blessed to have lived in this town for 69 years. I've got 3 generations. My son is one of my renters. I'm providing a home for my grandchildren, and I want them to stay here in town. So it is critical that we continue to provide housing that's affordable in this township, rents that are affordable in this township, if we really want to talk about diversity. And let's be honest, let's not live on an old reputation. Let's move our reputation forward. If we're going to be a town of diversity, and evenness and fairness, that is absolutely where we should be going. We need to renew that commitment to diversity in this township. So that's extremely important. Councilwoman Baskerville, we have worked together for over 10 years on housing in this township. We've got other members in the audience. Harold Simons, I don't know if he's still hiding back there, but Harold, he has been my mentor, okay? He tells me he wonders why I continue to do the things I do, but it's because of the direction he's given me. Megan, we've got some great people that have been on the Housing Commission. And one thing I would like to make sure, we have some openings on the Housing Commission. We need people to come and join the Housing Commission. Bring your thoughts and ideas to the table. We will absolutely listen, and we will move those thoughts and ideas forward to council. We can agree and we can disagree, but they are open-minded. We spend a lot of time at the planning board meetings. We don't miss anything when it comes to housing in this township. So absolutely know that you've always had a voice, at least for the last 10 plus years, that we have made sure that we want to make sure that the 20% is one thing, but I always looked at the standpoint, the glass is only half full. If you don't have some sort of rent stabilization or rent control, people are going out the back door in large and larger numbers. So I don't want to go on and on and on, but I'll try to end on that note. Again, the panelists, you guys have been wonderful. Okay. People sort of said that I was kind of crazy to do this, but I'm not crazy. This is something that needed to be done, and we will continue to do this, okay? And thank the audience. I mean, I appreciate you coming out, okay? And Mayor Jackson, absolutely, we're a partner. Bob Russo, he's also a councilman. And I want to also thank my NAACP Housing Committee representatives. We have got Kathy Hawley here. She's one of my members of my Housing Committee in the NAACP. Okay. Frida McLean, she's also a member of the NAACP Housing Committee. Okay. I just recently signed up Deirdre, okay? Not only is she my co-chair on the Housing Commission, but she is now a committee on the NAACP Housing Committee, okay? And Councilwoman Baskerville is also a member of my Housing Committee from an NAACP standpoint. So, thank you again, and I think we had a great exchange of information. And if anybody still wants to sign up on this sheet, please do so. Excuse me, and Vice President James Harris of the NAACP, okay? And absolutely, when we talk about diversity, it goes right to our educational system. He has been an advocate, involved in the education committee for the NAACP for, I know it's over 10 years, but he knows, he sees the numbers. When we see the numbers dropping at the elementary school level, 5-10 years from now, that will be in the high school level. Diversity will no longer be the point in this township. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Good. Great job. Thank you guys very, very much. Excellent.